Before the muscle car boom truly ignited in the mid-1960s, a handful of American manufacturers were already experimenting with big engines, bold styling, and raw power. These were the muscle cars before muscle car was even a term. In 1960, Detroit flirted with horsepower in full-size coupes and sport sedans that could scorch the quarter mile. Yet for one reason or another, they were hidden, ignored, or quietly killed off. Here are 11 forgotten American muscle cars from 1960 that roared with promise and then disappeared into the shadows.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 11, the 1965 Dodge Coronet A90 Hemi, one of the wildest factory-built muscle machines of the 1960s, and a car that never pretended to be street legal. Today, we're diving into one of the most extreme muscle machines ever to come from Detroit, a car that was never meant to cruise Main Street or impress your date at the drive-in. The 1965 Dodge Coronet A90 Hemi wasn't built for looks or comfort. It was built to kill at the drag strip. This was Mopar's nuclear option in the escalating horsepower wars. A lightweight, factory-built race car with a purpose-built 426 race Hemi, aluminum body panels, and nothing even resembling civility. Only a handful were made. They were terrifying, glorious, and entirely unfit for public roads. And that's exactly what made them legendary. By the mid-1960s, Detroit was knee-deep in the drag racing arms race. The NHRA Superstock class was the hotbed of factory performance. Ford, Chevrolet, Plymouth, and Dodge were all throwing increasingly wild machines into the mix. These weren't modified by racers, they were modified by the factories themselves. The idea? Get sanctioned by NHRA rules, win on Sunday, and let the showroom benefit on Monday. Dodge had played around with max wedge engines in the early 60s, but they were being outgunned by Ford's 427s and Chevy's big blocks. So Dodge unleashed the ultimate weapon, the 426 Hemi, a race-bred engine designed to flatten the competition. Dodge took the lightweight B-body Coronet and stripped it to the bone for the A990 package. Notable features of the A990 package: engine, 426 CU, in race Hemi, with solid lifters and dual Holley 770 CFM carburetors. Power output, officially rated at 425 horsepower, realistically closer to 500 horsepower. Weight reduction, aluminum front fenders, hood, doors, plexiglass side windows. No sound deadening, no radio, no heater, no carpet. Thin seats from Dodge van. Transmission, heavy-duty 4-speed manual or 727 torque flight automatic. Rear end, 8 3/4-inch axle with 4.56 or 4.88 gears. Production, fewer than 102 units built. This wasn't just a street car with a big engine. This was a purpose-built weapon. Dodge even coded these as Superstock, drag only, in the VIN. The heart of the A990 was the 426 Hemi, the engine that would become legendary in NASCAR and NHRA history. Unlike the later street Hemi that debuted in 1966, this was the pure racing version with cross-bolted mains, free-breathing hemispherical combustion chambers, 12.5:1 compression ratio, high-lift camshaft, massive valve area for superior airflow. It was an engine that loved high RPMs and could survive the brutal punishment of quarter-mile abuse run after run. The A990 wasn't just fast, it was dominant. In the hands of experienced drivers like Dick Landy, Ronnie Sox, and Arlen Vonke, the A990s became icons of NHRA Superstock. The A990 was a one-year wonder. Why? It couldn't be sold as a street car, it lacked basic amenities, and tuning the Hemi for street duty was almost impossible in this form. NHRA rules changed, and the dominance of these factory-built cars led to stricter homologation standards. Dodge pivoted to the street Hemi in 1966, a more refined, livable version that would appear in B-bodies like the Charger, Coronet RT, and GTX. Simply put, the A990 was too extreme for widespread production, and that was the point. Dodge built it not for profit, but for dominance. Today, the 1965 Dodge Coronet A90 Hemi is one of the most desirable Mopar collector cars in existence. Survivors fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction. Many were raced into oblivion, making surviving examples incredibly rare. The A990 helps cement the 426 Hemi's legendary reputation, both at the drag strip and in the performance mythology of the 1960s. It was the blueprint for what a factory drag car could be. It was raw, uncompromising, and brutal, and that made it unforgettable. Number 10, the 1966 Mercury Cyclone GT, a fastback muscle car that tried to carve a place between Ford's racing ambition and showroom marketing, but never truly escaped the long shadow of the Mustang. Today, we'll explore the 1966 Mercury Cyclone GT, a muscle car that had real firepower, striking styling, and a legitimate racing presence, yet remains an underdog in the annals of muscle car history. Powered by Ford's robust 390 cubic inch V8, the Cyclone GT looked the part and ran the numbers. It had all the right ingredients: fastback lines, red racing stripes, bucket seats, and optional 4-speed transmission. But there was one problem: the Mustang. Ford's runaway pony car success overshadowed everything in the Mercury lineup, even when those cars could outperform it. Let's uncover why the Cyclone GT mattered, why it was largely forgotten, and how it played a supporting role in the muscle car boom. To understand the 1966 Cyclone GT, we need to first understand where Mercury stood in the Ford Motor Company hierarchy. Mercury was the premium division, intended to offer a step up from Ford but without encroaching on Lincoln luxury. But that positioning made Mercury products feel confused. Were they performance cars? Luxury cruisers? Slightly nicer Fords? By the mid-1960s, Ford had the Mustang, Galaxy 500, and Fairlane all generating excitement. Mercury? It had the Comet, a compact car originally developed for Edsel, and it needed a performance halo. That's where the Cyclone GT came in. In 1966, Mercury restyled the Comet line into a more aggressive mid-size platform. The Cyclone GT sat at the top of the range, blending performance and sport styling in a way that clearly targeted the GTO, Fairlane GT, and even the Mustang GT. Key specs of the 1966 Cyclone GT: engine, 390 cubic inch V8, S-code. Horsepower, 335 horsepower at 4,800 RPM. Torque, 427 pound-foot at 3,200 RPM. Transmission, standard 4-speed manual, optional C6 automatic. 0-60 miles per hour, approximately 7.0 seconds. Quarter mile, low 15 stock. Curb weight, 3,500 plus pounds. Price, $3,000. In essence, it was a mid-size muscle car with big block power, offered just as the segment was heating up. The Cyclone GT came standard with bucket seats, center console, performance suspension, dual exhaust, GT, red accent stripes, and special badging. Object fastback roofline, which gave it a NASCAR-ready profile. Despite its showroom ambiguity, the Cyclone GT had real racing ambitions. In fact, Mercury's NASCAR program for 1966 leaned heavily on the Comet Cyclone GT's fastback shape and big 427-powered versions, although not available to the public. Drivers like Parnelli Jones and David Pearson. Let's look at some of the factors that held the Cyclone GT back from muscle car stardom. Mercury never really knew how to sell the Cyclone GT. Was it a performance car, a gentleman's cruiser, a luxury muscle hybrid? Meanwhile, Pontiac was shouting GTO from the rooftops, and Ford had all eyes on the Mustang. The 390 V8 was also found in the Mustang GT, the Fairlane GT, the Galaxy 500 XL. With those options already in Ford's lineup, and all carrying more marketing weight, the Cyclone GT was left to compete in-house for attention. Other cars had iconic features: dual scoops, bold names, standout interiors. The Cyclone GT looked good, but didn't have that one memorable calling card. It was solid, just not unforgettable. While cars like the GTO and Chevel SS evolved rapidly with bigger engines and more style, The Cyclone GT didn't grow until later, and by then, it was too late. By the late 1960s, the Cyclone GT faded into the background as the Mercury Cougar took center stage as Mercury's performance offering. The 1967 Cougar gave Mercury its own pony car to promote. The Cyclone name carried on into the 70s, but was reshaped into a NASCAR-flavored personal coupe. The mid-60s Cyclone GTs? Rarely mentioned again. Even within Mercury, the Cyclone GT was treated like an experiment that didn't quite take off. Number 9, the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440 M Code, one of the boldest and most under-the-radar muscle machines Chrysler ever built. Today's topic is a true outlier in muscle car history. A factory-built monster that never had the marketing support it deserved, was never meant for the average driver, and only lived for a moment. We're talking about the 1968 Dodge Dart GTS 440, the legendary M Code Dart. This wasn't your typical Dodge Dart. It wasn't even a typical muscle car. This was a compact with a massive 440 cubic inch V8 shoehorned into the engine bay. Built to dominate the quarter mile, the M Code Dart was as wild as they come, and just as unmanageable for the average street driver. Let's unpack the context, specs, and legacy of this stripped-down, torqued-up, compact street killer. To appreciate why the 440 Dart was such an anomaly, we first need to understand where the Dodge Dart stood in the Chrysler hierarchy. Originally a compact economy car introduced in 1963, by 1968 the Dart was a cleanly styled, affordable compact with optional V8 performance. The Dart GTS was the performance model, usually offered with the 340 or 383 V8, fast but still manageable. But in the heat of the muscle car wars, Chrysler wanted to take things to the next level, and they did, with one of the most extreme factory builds in muscle history. In 1968, Dodge quietly approved a special order program, M Code, that allowed a limited number of Dart GTS models to be built with the 440 Magnum V8, pulled straight from the big Mopar B-bodies like the Charger RT and Coronet RT. This was never advertised in brochures and never meant for wide release. It was a factory racer, pure and simple. Key specs of the 1968 Dart GTS 440 M Code: engine, 440 cubic inch Magnum V8, horsepower, 375 horsepower at 4,600 RPM, torque, 480 pound-foot at 3,200 RPM, carburation, single 4-barrel, transmission, torque flight 727 automatic manual, not available, rear axle, 3.91 SureGrip Dana 60 to 60 miles per hour, mid 5-second range, quarter mile, low 13 stock. The 440 Magnum was a tight squeeze in the Dart's engine bay. Chrysler had to make special accommodations. No power steering, there was literally no room. No air conditioning, custom motor mounts, heavy-duty cooling, and revised K-frame. All cars were automatics because a clutch linkage couldn't fit. The result? A compact car with near supercar torque and absolutely savage acceleration. These Darts weren't built on the regular assembly line. They were hand-assembled under Chrysler's watch, primarily to give racers something close to a turnkey drag car. It was Dodge's way of saying, if you're serious about street racing, we'll give you the ultimate tool. But not many were made. Only about 50 to 80 M Code Dart GTS 440s were. These cars were primarily ordered by dealerships with close ties to superstock drag racing, such as Grand Spalding Dodge in Chicago and Mr. Norm's Dodge, who would sell them to performance-crazed buyers. Let's be clear, these cars were brutal. With nearly 500 pound-feet of torque and a 3,400 pound shell, traction was a myth. They had nose-heavy balance, poor handling, and would understeer into the next zip code if pushed on a curve. But in a straight line, they could humiliate 427 Chevelles, 428 Mustangs, and 440 Chargers alike. This wasn't a car for cruising or comfort. It had no radio, no power options, and no frills. Chrysler engineered it with one goal: to dominate the quarter mile. You might wonder why Dodge didn't make more or promote it more. There are several reasons. The 440 barely fit. There was no space for power steering or other luxuries, and cooling was always a challenge. These weren't easy to build. It was a non-standard engine swap that required special labor and parts, making large-scale production impractical. Chrysler was already prepping the 426 Hemi-powered Dart and Barracuda Superstock cars for NHRA racing. The M-Code 440 Darts were street-oriented, but that wasn't the priority. This car was too fast for most people to handle. It had no safety nets, and Chrysler feared lawsuits or backlash from reckless street use. Number 8. The 1969 Ford Torino Tallaladega, one of the most fascinating aero warriors ever created for NASCAR dominance. Today we take a deep dive into one of the most specialized and short-lived performance cars in American history, the 1969 Ford Torino Tallaladega. While it barely existed as a production model, it left a serious footprint in NASCAR and automotive design. This wasn't a car designed for street cred or showroom appeal. This was a purpose-built homologation car, born for one reason: to win at high speed. It was Ford's answer to the high-bank supertracks like Talladega and Daytona, where speed wasn't just horsepower, it was aerodynamics. Let's explore how Ford crafted the Talladega, how it performed, why it disappeared, and what legacy it left behind. By 1969, NASCAR had become an arms race. High-speed superspeedways like Daytona and Talladega were exposing the limits of conventional car designs. Chrysler had already begun experimenting with aerodynamic modifications, leading to the 1969 Dodge Charger 500 and eventually the legendary Daytona. Ford, eager to remain competitive, had to respond fast. Enter the Torino Tallaladega, a highly modified version of the Fairlane Torino Fastback with wind-cheating bodywork and a racing mission. The 1969 Ford Torino Tallaladega wasn't just a trim package. It was a specialized body designed to reduce drag and increase top speed for NASCAR racing. Key aerodynamic changes: extended front nose, 5 inches longer than a standard Torino, reshaped with a smooth, flush-mounted grille. Front bumper: a modified rear bumper was flipped and narrowed to create a low-profile leading edge, unheard of for a production car. Flush rocker panels, dropped to lower the entire car's stance. Seamless headlights, hidden behind a clean grille to reduce air turbulence. Fastback roofline, shared with the Torino GT, already a benefit at high speeds. The changes weren't for looks. They were strictly functional. The Talladega was slippery, stable, and fast, giving Ford drivers a crucial edge at 190+ miles per hour. To qualify for NASCAR competition, Ford had to build at least 500 street-legal versions of the race car, the process known as homologation. Ford built just under 750 units total. All were built in a short run between January and February 1969 at Ford's Atlanta plant. All cars came with a 428 Cobra jet engine, not the race-spec 427, automatic transmission, and minimal options. 3 body colors: Wimbledon white, presidential blue, and royal maroon. These were not luxury street cars. They were plain, fast, and hard-edged, with interiors closer to a base model than a muscle car. Ford didn't promote it heavily. The average buyer didn't even know what the Talladega was or why it mattered, which was exactly the point. On the racetrack, the Talladega made its presence known. Richard Petty, after leaving Plymouth, joined Ford and drove the Talladega to multiple victories. David Pearson, in a Holman Moody Talladega, dominated the 1969 season, winning 11 races and the championship. Ford tallied 30 wins in 1969, more than any other manufacturer. Thanks to its slipperier body and big 427 race engine, used only in actual race cars, not the street versions, the Talladega outpaced Dodge's Charger 500 and pushed Chrysler to come back with a vengeance, which led directly to the 1969 Charger Daytona and later the 1970 Plymouth Superbird. The Aero Wars had officially begun. Despite its success, the Talladega had a short shelf life. Why? NASCAR soon recognized that the Aero War was getting out of hand. The cars were getting too fast and too dangerous. New regulations limited how radical these cars could become and placed restrictions on engines and production numbers. With the Charger, Daytona, and Superbird using even more extreme nose cones and wings, Ford had to choose between escalating the arms race or focusing elsewhere. Ford chose to bow out of further homologation madness. By 1970, Ford shifted attention toward street muscle, like the Torino Cobra and Boss Mustangs, leaving the Tallaladega as a one-hit wonder in the homologation war. Today, the 1969 Ford Torino Tallaladega is one of the most underrated legends in muscle car history. It's rare, only about 750 built. Number 7, the 1966 Buick Skylark Grand Sport GS 401 Nailhead, one of the early and often overlooked players in the muscle car era. Today, we're going to explore a car that helped launch a brand into the muscle car race, but did it with restraint, refinement, and a sense of decorum that may have ultimately held it back. I'm talking about the 1966 Buick Skylark Grand Sport, featuring the famous 401 cubic inch Nailhead V8. While its muscle car contemporaries shouted their presence with stripes, scoops, and tire smoke, the Skylark GS took a quieter, more buttoned-up approach. It had serious torque, a big block engine, and respectable performance, but it also carried Buick's gentlemanly image, and that contrast ultimately shaped its success and its limits. Let's rewind to the mid-1960s. 1964, Pontiac launches the GTO and essentially creates the muscle car category. Other GM divisions rush to respond. Chevrolet has the Chevel SS, Oldsmobile launches the 442, and by 1965, Buick brings out the Grand Sport variant of the Skylark. Why the Skylark? The Skylark was Buick's intermediate, a comfortable, mid-size car that could serve as the perfect base for performance without giving up refinement. Buick, aiming to attract a younger customer without alienating its traditional clientele, decided to offer performance wrapped in a luxury show. The result? The 1966 Skylark Grand Sport 401, a muscle car that wouldn't wrinkle its sport coat. The star of the show was the 401 cubic inch V8, known internally as the Nailhead. Why was it called the Nailhead? The term came from its small diameter valves and vertical valve arrangement, which made them look like large nails. This design limited high RPM breathing, but made up for it with massive low-end torque. Specs: 325 horsepower, 445 pounds-feet of torque, standard 3-speed manual, optional 4-speed or 2-speed automatic, super turbine 300, 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 6.5 seconds. Very quick for 1966. This engine was an old-school brute, heavy, torquey, and built for effortless acceleration rather than redline screaming. Buick marketed it as Wildcat 445, referring to its torque, not its displacement. But here's the catch. The 401 was not a new engine in 1966. It dated back to the late 1950s, and it was nearing the end of its engineering life. Meanwhile, competitors like Pontiac and Chrysler were innovating with more modern, free-breathing engines. Let's talk about design because image mattered in the muscle car era. The 1966 Skylark GS shared its body with the standard Skylark Coupe. Clean, understated lines, small GS badging, a faux hood scoop, non-functional, optional vinyl top. Inside, it was typical Buick. More upscale than a Chevel SS or GTO, Buick was still perceived as the brand for doctors, managers, and grandfathers, not teenage drag racers. Even though the Grand Sport could outrun many rivals, it didn't look or feel like a street brawler, and that hurt its appeal with the emerging youth performance market. On the street, the 1966 GS 401 was a torque monster. It had excellent straight-line punch, smooth cruising on the highway, a more refined ride than most muscle cars. However, there were drawbacks. The heavy iron block engine gave it a nose-heavy feel. Handling was average, not sporty. Not a canyon carver by any means. The drum brakes could be overtaxed during aggressive driving. It lacked the racy suspension setups found on 442s or even GTOs with optional packages. Buick wasn't aiming for track performance. They wanted muscle with manners. But in a world chasing quarter-mile times and wild styling, that formula didn't ignite the market. In 1966, the Skylark GS sold about 13,800 units. Not terrible, but far behind leaders like Pontiac GTO, 96,946 units, Chevrolet Chevel SS3, 72,000 plus units. It found a niche with older buyers who wanted performance without boy racer flash. But that wasn't enough to make it a household name. The GS name would evolve and survive, particularly with the 1970 GS 455 and GSX. But the 1966 GS 401 was quickly forgotten in the wider muscle car war. Number 6, the 1967 Chevrolet Biscane 427, a stealthy full-size sedan that punched well above its weight, if you knew how to order it. Today, we dive into one of the most underappreciated performance cars of the 1960s. Not a flashy pony car or a legendary muscle coupe, but a budget-friendly, full-size sedan that could blow the doors off nearly anything on the road if you ordered it right. I'm talking about the 1967 Chevrolet Biscane 427, a car that wore no stripes, had no hood scoops, and sat low in the Chevy hierarchy. But under the hood, Corvette-grade power, it was a true factory sleeper, built for savvy buyers who knew how to play GM's internal ordering game. To understand the 427 Biscane, we first need to understand the Biscane model itself. The Chevrolet Biscane was Chevy's base full-size model, sitting beneath the Bel Air and Impala. Designed primarily for fleet use, taxis, police cars, budget-minded families, it featured minimal trim, vinyl seats, and few luxury options. It was cheap, simple, and light for a full-size car, which made it the perfect sleeper platform. The 1967 version was no different. Plain Jane looks, bench seats, and steel wheels, nothing flashy at all. But for those in the know, the Biscane could be ordered with serious powertrains through Chevrolet's COPO, Central Office Production Order, system or high-performance RPOs, regular production options. Now let's talk about what made this car a true muscle car in disguise. The 427 cubic inch V8. In 1967, Chevrolet offered two versions of the 427 in full-size cars like the Biscane. L36, 385 horsepower, hydraulic cam, relatively mild manners. L72, 425 horsepower, solid lifter cam, high compression, same engine found in the Corvette. The L72 version was the real monster. Here are the specs. 425 horsepower at 5,600 RPM, 460 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM, 11-to-1 compression, solid lifter camshaft, aluminum intake, Holley 4-barrel carburetor. All of this was hidden inside a bland 4-door or 2-door sedan that looked like a rental car. Buyers could pair it with a Muncie 4-speed manual, heavy-duty suspension, and posi-traction rear axle, turning the car into a legitimate drag strip terror. What did that translate to on the street or strip? 0 to 60 miles per hour in around 6 seconds, depending on gearing. Quarter-mile times in the 13s. Top speed around 140 miles per hour. This was supercar territory for the era, all from a full-size sedan that most people wouldn't look at twice. And here's the kicker. Because it was a stripper model, the Biscane was hundreds of pounds lighter than the better-trimmed Impala or Caprice. This weight advantage, combined with big block torque, made it a genuine performer. So why didn't the Biscane 427 become a legend? There are several reasons. General Motors had a self-imposed ban on promoting high-performance full-size cars. They didn't want the image of big sedans as drag racers. That was left to smaller cars like the Chevel SS or the new Camaro. 1967 was the first year of the Camaro, and it sucked up all the marketing oxygen. The Chevel SS 396 was a known performance brand by this point, more stylish, more youth-focused, and far more heavily promoted. A Biscane was seen as a fleet special, a car your uncle drove for work, not to cruise for street races. It lacked the visual identity of a muscle car, so many buyers simply overlooked it, even though it could embarrass pricier models. The 1967 Biscane 427 wasn't built for everyone, but it attracted drag racers who wanted cheap power and little fluff, police departments who sometimes ordered them with performance packages, performance enthusiasts who knew how to custom order the car to their spec, often working with dealership insiders or reading the fine print in order books. It wasn't a high-volume car. While exact production numbers are hard to pin down, L72-equipped Biscanes are extremely rare today. Fewer than 200 were built with a 425 horsepower engine in 1967. Number 5. The 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix SJ428HO, a personal luxury coupe that hid serious muscle beneath its formal suit, but never quite got the performance credit it deserved. Today's subject takes us off the typical path of muscle cars and into the strange crossroads of performance and personal luxury. A niche Pontiac attempted to dominate with a car that had both swagger and serious horsepower. We're talking about the 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix SJ428HO, a personal luxury coupe with a monster V8 under a massive hood and a 390 horsepower punch most buyers never fully appreciated. Overshadowed by the flashy, youth-oriented GTO, the Grand Prix SJ was Pontiac's attempt to sell muscle to mature buyers who didn't want to give up speed, but didn't want a vinyl-clad street racer either. Let's explore its origin, performance, design, and why it ultimately failed to win over the muscle car crowd. In 1969, the American car market was splitting. On one side, you had pony and muscle cars, GTOs, Camaros, Roadrunners, designed for the young, the loud, and the fast. On the other, you had the personal luxury segment, cars like the Ford Thunderbird or Buick Riviera, longer, sleeker coupes aimed at adults who wanted comfort, style, and exclusivity. Pontiac, with its performance-focused image, decided to blend both worlds with the redesigned 1969 Grand Prix. And they didn't just redesign it, they reimagined it. The 1969 Grand Prix moved to a newly shortened version of GM's full-size platform, called the G-Body, giving it a sportier stance while retaining interior comfort. Its most noticeable styling feature? That massive hood, the longest in the industry at the time. Paired with a sharp grille and tucked-in rear end, it looked more like a custom coach-built machine than a showroom model. Design John DeLorean, always a fan of performance, made sure the Grand Prix didn't just look confident, it had the specs to back it up. Enter the SJ package, short for Sport Jet. The 1969 Grand Prix SJ could be ordered with a serious engine, the 428 cubic inch high-output V8. Here's what you got: 390 horsepower at 5,200 RPM, 472 lb-ft of torque at 3,400 RPM, 10.75-in-1 compression, big Rochester 4-barrel carb, heavy-duty crankshaft, special camshaft, and high-flow exhaust. This was the same fire breather you'd find in a full-on Pontiac muscle car, but now tucked into a car with leather trim, wood grain dash, and power accessories. Pontiac offered this with either a turbo 400 automatic or a 3-speed manual, though nearly all were automatics. And yet, despite its muscle credentials, the SJ never caught fire with performance buyers. Why? The styling, while bold, signaled luxury more than speed, which turned away traditional muscle car buyers. Most drivers opted for the standard 400 or base 428, leaving the high-output SJ as a niche variant. In essence, the SJ428HO offered muscle car performance in disguise, but buyers who wanted real speed went elsewhere, and buyers who wanted luxury rarely checked the HO box. Pontiac's biggest enemy might have been its own success, namely the GTO. The GTO had a younger audience, massive media coverage, and a defined brand as a muscle car icon. The Grand Prix, by contrast, had little promotion as a performance machine. Pontiac's own marketing pitched it as executive excitement, aiming for a different buyer entirely. So while the GTO was out there burning rubber and winning magazine shootouts, the Grand Prix SJ remained a quiet giant, respected but overlooked. The 428HO didn't last long. 1969 was the final year for the 428 engine, replaced in 1970 by the larger 455. Emissions, insurance, and the shift toward even more luxury further muted performance variants of the Grand Prix. The SJ name survived, but the raw performance focus was softened in later years. Number 4. The 1969 Mercury Cougar Eliminator Boss 3002, a rare and potent muscle car that lived briefly in the shadow of its more famous sibling, the Mustang, and ultimately faded before it got the credit it deserved. Today, we take a close look at a rare and underrated muscle car, the 1969 Mercury Cougar Eliminator Boss 3002. This car is one of the great what-ifs of the muscle car era. It had the hardware, it had the styling, and it had the pedigree. But what it lacked was timing and attention. While the Mustang dominated headlines and showroom floors, Mercury's high-performance Cougar Eliminator was a quieter, more refined alternative, offered with multiple engines including the revered Boss 302. Let's dissect how this bold, fast, and highly capable machine came to be, and why it ultimately vanished after a short 2-year run. Mercury was Ford's middle-tier brand, slotting between the everyday Ford lineup and the upscale Lincoln nameplate. It had a reputation for being slightly more refined, less aggressive, and more mature than its Ford siblings. In 1967, Mercury introduced the Cougar, its answer to the Mustang, but with a longer wheelbase, more luxury appointments, and a distinctively styled front end with hidden headlights. While the Mustang screamed youth and rebellion, the Cougar whispered sophistication and poise. That was Mercury's brand strategy until 1969. In 1969, Mercury decided it wanted in on the muscle car wars. That's when the Cougar Eliminator package was born. The 1969 Cougar Eliminator was Mercury's attempt to shed the country club image and get serious about performance. This wasn't just a stripe and wheel package. It came with a front air dam, rear spoiler, blacked-out grille, and bold side stripes. Bright colors like competition orange, grabber blue, and bright yellow screamed muscle car, not mid-level luxury. A tachometer, performance suspension, and upgraded tires came standard. And under the hood, buyers had options, serious options. The top dog was the Boss 302 engine, a transplant from the Mustang Boss 302, designed for Trans Am racing homologation. The Boss 302 engine was a high-revving small-block beast that Ford created to compete in the SCCA Trans Am series. Here's what made it special. 290 horsepower, underrated real output closer to 350 horsepower, high compression 10.5 to 1, solid lifter camshaft, special high-flow heads and internals, 4-barrel carburetor, close ratio 4-speed manual was standard with the Boss. In the Cougar Eliminator, this engine transformed Mercury's image, at least briefly, into a true street contender. Despite being heavier than the Mustang, the Cougar with the Boss 302 could still run the quarter mile in the low 14s, with a top speed north of 120 miles per hour. This was serious performance, wrapped in what looked like a slightly more grown-up Mustang. So why didn't it catch on? A few key issues. The Cougar Eliminator with the Boss 302 was significantly more expensive than a comparable Mustang Mach 1 or Boss 302. Mercury was a premium brand, and you paid for it. Mercury's buyer base skewed older and more conservative. Many potential Eliminator buyers had no idea Mercury was even offering a serious performance car. And Mustang buyers? They weren't interested in paying more for what they saw as the same car in a tuxedo. Ford threw its marketing weight behind the Mustang Boss 302, which was tied directly to Trans Am racing. The Cougar Boss 302 shared the same engine, but got almost zero racing visibility and little promotional support. Fewer than 2,500 Cougar Eliminators were built in 1969, and only 169 were Boss 302 equipped. It was an ultra-niche model from day one. In 1970, the Eliminator returned, with some slight visual tweaks and more engine choices, including the 428 Cobra Jet and again, the Boss 302. But the market was shifting. Insurance rates were climbing. Emissions regulations loomed. Buyers were turning to smaller, cheaper pony cars or abandoning muscle altogether. By the end of 1970, the Cougar Eliminator program was canceled. Mercury moved the Cougar further upmarket, distancing it from muscle cars and steering toward luxury coupes like the Montego. And eventually, the Cougar XR7 became a plush personal car, not a bruiser. Number 3, the 1968 Chevrolet Nova SS 396, a car that embodied sleeper muscle in a compact shell, and yet vanished almost as quietly as it arrived. Today, we examine one of the most understated yet potent muscle cars of the late 1960s, the 1968 Chevrolet Nova SS 396. It was a car that never got the spotlight but had the firepower to humble bigger, flashier competitors. With clean styling and Chevrolet's brutal L78 396 cubic inch V8, the 68 Nova SS became one of the era's most effective sleepers. But despite its potential, General Motors gave it limited support, barely marketed it, and ultimately let it fade into muscle car obscurity. This is a case study in raw performance hidden beneath a modest suit, and how corporate caution kept it from becoming a legend. To understand the 1968 Nova SS 396, we need context. The Chevrolet Nova began life in 1962 as the Chevy 2, a no-nonsense compact aimed at economy car buyers. Simple, light, and cheap, the early Novas were practical transportation with very little flair. But by 1968, muscle mania was in full swing, and Chevrolet saw an opportunity to drop big power into a small package. That year, the Nova got a full redesign. Clean boxy lines, a longer hood and shorter rear deck, a more aggressive stance, and most importantly, an updated engine bay that could handle big block engines. This would be the basis for the most powerful, yet most understated Nova ever built. The Supersport SS badge on a Nova wasn't new, but it rarely meant true muscle, until 1968. That year, Chevrolet offered the Nova SS with a choice of two big block 396 V8s. The L34, producing 350 horsepower, and the L78 rated at 375 horsepower. But the L78 was the true monster. It had 11.0 to 1 compression, solid lifter camshaft, high-flow cylinder heads, Holley 800 CFM 4-barrel carburetor, heavy-duty internals, and 4-bolt mains. This was essentially a Corvette-grade engine dropped into a 2,900-pound compact. The power-to-weight ratio was explosive. The result? In a straight line, the 1968 Nova SS 396 could easily run the quarter mile in the low 13s with tuning, and with slicks, even into the high 12s. This made it one of the fastest factory Chevrolets of the year, faster than many Chevelles, faster than Camaros, and able to outrun Mopars costing much more. What made the Nova SS 396 even more dangerous was its lack of flash. There were no wings, no scoops, no wild paint schemes. Even the SS badging was minimal. A small badge on the grille and rear panel. It wore simple chrome trim, steel wheels with dog dish hubcaps, and a flat hood, no bulge or scoop. To the untrained eye, so why didn't this car become an icon? Two key reasons. General Motors had an unwritten rule in the 1960s. No midsize or compact car was supposed to have more than 400 cubic inches. The Nova 396 broke that rule quietly, but GM didn't want to draw attention to it. Chevrolet made the L78 Nova available, but only via special order. There were no TV commercials, no big ad campaigns. Chevy never raced the Nova SS 396 officially, nor did it push it in the performance press. It was as if GM was trying to downplay its existence. A car they feared might look reckless or threaten sales of their larger performance models, like the Chevel SS 396. In 1968, only about 667 Novas were built with the L78 engine. It wasn't even listed on the main order sheets. Buyers had to know what to ask for. It was a car for insiders, not the mainstream market. This scarcity meant that few people saw them at dealerships, and fewer still understood what they were capable of. Those who did manage to get their hands on a 1968 Nova SS 396 L78 were impressed and often shocked. In street racing circles, these Novas became local legends, taking down bigger, heavier muscle cars with ease. Their combination of lightweight, big torque, short gearing, 4.10 to 1 or 3.73 to 1, and minimal option. Number 2, the rare and legendary 1966 Oldsmobile 442W30, a car built for serious racers, but one that nearly no one knew about when it was new. Today we dive into the obscure world of Oldsmobile performance with one of the most underrated factory muscle cars of the 1960s, the 1966 Oldsmobile 442W30. This was a car not built for mass appeal, but for drag racers who knew exactly what they needed. Featuring cold air induction, heavy-duty internals, and NHRA certification, this version of the 442 wasn't flashy, it was focused. But only 54 units were built, and even fewer people heard about it back then. It's a case study of a car that could have been a star if only its own company had made some noise. To understand the W30 package, we first need to understand the Oldsmobile 442 itself. Originally introduced in 1964 as Oldsmobile's answer to the Pontiac GTO, the 442 stood for 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed manual, dual exhaust. It was positioned as a muscle car for grown-ups, refined, better engineered, and more expensive than its Pontiac or Chevy cousins. By 1966, the 442 had gained a 400 cubic inch V8, upgraded suspension, and a reputation for solid street performance. But that wasn't enough for a select group of customers, drag racers. They wanted more power, more cooling, less fluff. And that's where the W30 package came in. Oldsmobile had a quiet goal in 1966, to get its 442 homologated for NHRA Superstock drag racing. But in order to do that, it had to sell a minimum of 50 production cars with the necessary equipment. Thus was born the W30 option, a factory-approved drag racing setup available only to customers who knew what to ask for. The W30 package included, this was not your average hood scoop. Olds engineers routed fresh, cool air from twin ducts mounted behind the front bumper directly into the air cleaner. This provided denser, cooler air, improving combustion and performance. While it was still rated at 360 horsepower to comply with GM's internal policies, the W30's 400 was far from ordinary. Special camshaft, higher lift valve springs, strengthened bottom end, recalibrated carburation. It was estimated to make well over 400 horsepower unofficially, for better weight distribution during launches. Futural, but also a subtle calling card, the red fender wells were one of the few visual cues that this was something special. This was drag strip engineering in factory form, meant to be street legal but competition capable. Despite the performance focus, the 1966 442 W30 faced a major issue: no marketing. There were no flashy brochures, no dealer window displays, no commercials, no bold stripes or callouts. It was a word-of-mouth option, quietly offered to customers who knew to ask for option code W30 and who had the budget to go drag racing. This makes the 66 W30 not only incredibly rare, but also a hidden cornerstone in muscle car history. A car few saw, even fewer bought, and fewer still have survived. Those who did know about the W30 and took it to the drag strip found a surprisingly competitive machine. In NHRA trim, the car could run mid to high 13s in the quarter mile, very quick for a full-bodied car in the mid-1960s, and a threat to Hemis and big block Chevys. Its performance was aided by factory weight distribution mods, engine breathing upgrades, bulletproof driveline components. The 442 W30 didn't need flashy decals. It let its time slips do the talking. Oldsmobile took what it learned from the 1966 W30 experiment and expanded on it in future years. By 1967, the W30 became a regular production option available to anyone, not just racers, and now offered with an automatic transmission. That year, around 500 W30 cars were sold, and they came with more visible badging, optional scooped hoods, and factory performance gear. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, the W30 badge would become Oldsmobile's top-level performance brand, appearing on the 1968 to 1971 442s and even some Hurst-Olds variants. But it all started with those first 54 cars in 1966, nearly forgotten because Oldsmobile refused to shine a light on them. Number 1. The 1967 Chevel SS 396 L78, a muscle car powerhouse in a mid-size package that was both feared and constrained by its era. Today, we are diving into one of the most celebrated muscle cars of the late 1960s, the 1967 Chevrolet Chevel SS 396, specifically the L78 variant. This car is a true icon of American muscle, combining the power of a big block V8 with the manageable size and handling of a midsize car. The L78 was the highest performance 396 offered that year, boasting over 375 horsepower and delivering brutal acceleration. But the 1967 Chevel SS 396 L78's reign was short-lived. It existed during a pivotal moment in muscle car history, caught between the peak of factory horsepower and the looming threat of federal regulations, insurance hikes, and changing market attitudes. The Chevel was Chevrolet's answer to the booming midsize muscle car segment in the 1960s. Launched in 1964, it filled the gap between the smaller Chevy 2 and the full-size Impala, offering a solid, versatile platform. The SS Supersport trim was introduced to give Chevy buyers a factory-backed, high-performance option, aimed squarely at the muscle car enthusiasts flocking to the Pontiac GTO, Ford Fairlane GT, and Dodge Coronet RT. The 1967 model was the second full year of the Chevel SS 396, and it represented the peak of power before muscle cars faced increasing restrictions. Among the available 396 engines in 1967, L35, L37, L34, and L78, the L78 was king. Engine 396 cubic inches, 6.5 liters, V8, power output, factory rated at 375 horsepower at 5,600 RPM. Torque, a robust 415 lb-ft at 3,600 RPM carburation. Quadrajet 4-barrel carburetor feeding a solid lifter camshaft. Compression ratio 10.25 to 1. Exhaust, dual exhaust system standard, aiding power and sound. The L78 engine was derived from Chevrolet's big block design, featuring stronger internals and a camshaft optimized for maximum power at higher RPMs. It was the sort of engine that could pin you to the seat, making the Chevel SS a street-legal rocket. With a factory rating above 375 horsepower, though enthusiasts believe it was often underrated, the L78 Chevel SS was capable of quarter-mile times in the low 14-second range or better, depending on setup. The 1967 Chevel SS 396 wasn't just about the engine. It was a complete performance package designed to handle the muscle it produced. Heavy-duty springs, front and rear sway bars, and better shocks to keep the car stable at speed, 4-speed manual or turbo 400 automatic. The manual was highly prized for those who wanted full control. Front disc brakes were optional, a performance upgrade. The late 1960s was a golden era for muscle cars. Horsepower wars pushed manufacturers to offer ever more powerful engines and aggressive packages. But 1967 was also a watershed year. The government began imposing stricter emission standards that would reduce performance in coming years. Muscle cars with big engines began to see insurance premiums skyrocket, pricing many buyers out of the market. While not as pronounced yet as in the 1970s, the writing was on the wall. Muscle cars were increasingly seen as risky and irresponsible, especially with growing safety and environmental awareness. All these factors led manufacturers like Chevrolet to gradually reduce horsepower offerings or make them less accessible. Although the 1967 L78 Chevel SS was a beast, its time was limited. In 1968, Chevrolet increased the rated horsepower of the L78 to 375 horsepower, from 360 horse for the year prior, but began adding emissions equipment that reduced real-world performance. By 1970, the Chevel SS would see power creep, but face growing regulation and insurance issues. The high-compression, high-horsepower engines would be detuned, and the muscle car era would decline dramatically in the early 1970s. For many enthusiasts, the 1967 Chevel SS 396 L78 represents the peak moment of unfiltered muscle power before external factors started pulling back the throttle.